Texas and Oklahoma leave the Big 12 for the SEC. What does it mean for college football? I'll discuss it next. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
And a personal foul on number 99 of the defense after he tackled the quarterback. He's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Well, welcome in, everyone. Yes, this is Jay Smith, and yes, this is After Further Review. I know that it's been a little while. It has been a little while since we have done an episode of AFR. A lot has changed, and I feel like I owe at least a short explanation. You've probably noticed that if you're watching the show on Facebook, if you ever tune in and check out the show on Facebook, that the background is different. I am in a new apartment in the Charlotte area. I've taken a new job up here with Fox Sports, and so that is where I'm situated now, as opposed to previously being in Oxford, Mississippi, while attending grad school at Ole Miss, which I completed in May of this year. So there's been a lot going on, and just so much has changed the last couple of months, just not only with me, but also college football. And I've been wanting to do episodes. I've been wanting to push out some new content. I just haven't had a chance to sit down and get around to it. But I actually have had several people ask, hey, when are you going to put an episode out? Hey, are you going to get back into the AFR thing? And so that's definitely been a motivator, and I'm excited. And, this whole season coming ahead here, it's actually going to start here in a few weeks. I'm excited to talk about, break down. But yeah, I mean, it's been a little while. It's been since April 16th. That was our last AFR, talking about transfer freedom in college football and the ins and outs of that. And my goodness, I mean, look at all that's transpired in just a few months, man. I've been out of the action for a few months, and I've missed so much. So I'm excited to get back into it. I want to, really start posting regularly again. Episodes will still air on both Anchor, if you listen to the show as a podcast, and they will still hopefully be available on Facebook. That's really dependent on if I can get the uploads pushed through. Sometimes Facebook has some issues processing video files of a certain size, and these episodes tend to be pretty long, and so I'm hoping that the Wi-Fi in this new apartment can handle that. But either way, they will definitely be up as podcasts on Anchor, so if you're subscribed there, or if you listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Cast, wherever you listen to your podcast, AFR will still be there, and hopefully Facebook as well. But I'll keep everybody in the loop with regards to that. All right, enough about me, enough about what I've been up to. Let's talk some college football, because wow, there's been a lot going on. I mean, I'm sure everybody has heard about the huge news that broke, last week, a couple weeks ago by now, Texas and Oklahoma. At first, it was some whisperings that they were looking to join the SEC. Word kind of leaked that those two, really the banner programs of the Big 12. And again, we'll get into the weeds here in a few minutes, but the Big 12 has not exactly been making its case the last few years to kind of, stay in that Power 5, if you will, right? There's been so many dynamics that have evolved over this new college football playoff era, and what that's been like, and the teams and the conferences that are represented in this CFP. And I mean, the Big 12, right? They've had Oklahoma, won a bunch of strung together some conference championships. They've made it to some playoffs, but it's been a rough go for the Big 12 in the CFP. Now, losing your two banner programs in Texas and Oklahoma certainly is a huge blow to the Big 12, and it's really, I think, honestly, I have paid more attention to what the Big 12 has been, not just what they put out in press releases and things of that nature that the commissioner has said, but also, just kind of how the schools are handling it. Because, everybody wants to make a big, just a talking point discussion about, well, how are Texas and Oklahoma going to fit in the SEC? And I don't think their divisions, I don't think any of that has been finalized, at least that I have not seen. Now, the membership is supposed to start in 2025. That is not something I expect to stay where it is. I expect that probably to change, if not next season, maybe 2 seasons from now. I just don't think that either school are going to be willing to wait until 2025. I have a feeling the lawyers are going to get involved, and they're going to be able to work out something with the Big 12. Another interesting nugget out of all of this was that initially, there was a little bit of a defensive position by Texas A&M, right? Texas A&M joined the SEC a few years back with Mizzou, and they were the only school from the Lone Star State to, play in the SEC. And initially, Jimbo and the president of A&M, the statements that they released, the stuff that they kind of touched on in their statements, was a little defensive, I thought. I felt like they were kind of being like, hey, wait a minute now, we're the Texas school for the SEC. We don't need another Texas school in our conference. Another interesting thing I was reading about, really, because I've just been kind of trying to catch up and pay attention to everything that's been going on. There was this gentleman's rule that's I've heard described and mentioned in a couple of reports that I've read, and basically the premise of this gentleman's rule within the SEC is that if you, as a school, as an institution, if you do not want another school from your state to join, the SEC, your conference, you have absolute veto power. That is the way that the rule read, and that it was how it was described in a few of these reports that I saw, was that basically, for any school out there who is in a state where there's multiple, I guess you'd say, powerhouse programs, like I guess South Carolina, right, where you've got Clemson in the Palmetto State with them, they theoretically would have absolute veto power. So even if South Carolina was the only school that opposed Clemson joining the SEC, that would still be enough to block that motion. Now, I know technically, according to the numbers, it has to be, I think, a 2/3 majority between the institutions that are currently in the SEC. So that's, I think, 11 out of 14 schools would need to approve a school's request to join. But still an interesting dynamic that initially a lot of people thought, well, wait a second now, maybe Texas A&M is going to shut down Texas's entry into the SEC. Can they even do that? Was another question that was posed, and doesn't seem to be an issue, at least currently, because there was a unanimous vote of yes for Texas and Oklahoma to join the SEC. So the conference voted, all the institutions were present, and a 14-0 decision in favor of the SEC has allowed Texas and Oklahoma to join their conference as of 2025. Now, Texas and Oklahoma have stated that they intend to remain in the Big 12 until their current grant of rights expires in 2025. However, and this is really the big if, and this kind of plays into the discussion we're about to have about super conferences and the future of college football. What does it mean? What does this move for Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC? What does it mean for the future of college football? Well, the crux of all this is, as we just touched on, right? Texas and Oklahoma have stated they're going to intend to remain in the Big 12 until their current grant of rights, expires in 2025. So television deals, things of that nature. But their moves to the SEC could be expedited if the Big 12 dissolves, or if the schools are willing to pay hefty exit fees. Now, of those two options, the Big 12 dissolving or the exit fees, which one is more likely? I think it's the Big 12 dissolving. I think Texas and Oklahoma, if they really, really, really wanted out, we would have already seen them come out and say, listen, we want to be in the SEC. We don't care what it costs for us to get out of the Big 12. We want out. We're willing to pay it. Done deal. Shake on it. Let's get out of here. We haven't seen that, right? They've already said publicly, nah, we want to stick around the Big 12. We're okay, through 2025. We'll pay our dues, and then we're going to hit the road. However, we go back to that statement where it's basically coming down to, if the Big 12 dissolves, if the conference ceases to exist, then they could get out of those grant of rights deals, Texas and Oklahoma. If you look at the Big 12 currently, right, this is a conference that in my time of doing this podcast since, what was that, 2016, I want to say, it's changed so much, just and its reputation across the country, its presence in the CFP, and kind of the powerhouse schools have shifted a little bit. But when you look at the Big 12 without Texas and Oklahoma, immediately, at least for me, I go, okay, who's the marquee team? Who's the marquee team? What's the marquee brand of the Big 12? I always felt like it was more Texas than Oklahoma. I know Texas has not had near the level of success that Oklahoma's had recently on the field, but Texas's brand is still the biggest in the country. It is. I mean, you got to look at the numbers, right? From a financial standpoint, Texas is the premier athletic program in the country with a budget that blows everybody else away. But if you look at the dynamics now of the Big 12, you're left with, and I'm going to go through these alphabetically here. You're left with Baylor, Iowa State, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, TCU, Texas Tech, and West Virginia. So you have 8 teams left in the Big 12, right? A conference that had 10 up to a few weeks ago. So the Big 12 is down to 8. And if I'm being honest with you, I don't see how a Power 5 conference can survive, let alone compete. We're not talking about competing anymore. We're talking about survival. Remember, visit back that sentence I spoke about 5 minutes ago, right? If the Big 12 dissolves, Texas and Oklahoma will not have to worry about their television rights deals, and they'll be able to get out of the conference that way. That is a very real possibility, because look at who's remaining in your conference. Baylor, okay? The Baylor Bears, a team that's, since the era of RG3 has had tons of ups and downs, both on and off the field. And in fact, you go back and you look at their schedule in 2020, and it was not a good year for Baylor. They had 3 postponements. Not sure that those games would have really resulted in victories. They beat Kansas pretty handily, but that's Kansas. They were able to squeak out a win against Kansas State by a point, 32-31. The rest are losses. I mean, yeah, you went to double overtime at West Virginia in your second game of the season, really week 4, but nothing else really stands out. I mean, all the games weren't close. They lost by at least a couple possessions, so that's a big X there, right, in terms of who's your brand if you're the Big 12. It's not Baylor. Certainly not Baylor. So who do you look at? You look at Oklahoma State, right? Is this a time where Oklahoma State, can the Cowboys sort of take the reins of the Big 12 and lead them into a new era? Maybe not. Oklahoma State, the Cowboys, right? They have been a team that has shown spurts of greatness, but have not been able to string it together. And when you look at the Cowboys, and their season last year in 2020, it certainly, again, more impressive than what Baylor was putting together, but still a three-loss team, and more importantly, a three-loss team that lost to Texas and Oklahoma, the schools that are leaving. So I'm using quotes here, your marquee team in Oklahoma State, if that's what you want to call the Cowboys, the new marquee team of the Big 12, they couldn't even beat the two teams that are leaving your conference last year, right? The two teams that are leaving your conference now, Oklahoma State, your marquee team, didn't beat them last year. Lost to Texas 41-34 in overtime. Close game that could have gone either way, but the Oklahoma loss on the road was a blowout. It was 41-13. Oklahoma State never even competed. Now, they also lost to TCU 29-22, but that doesn't quite stick out as much. So, again, if you're the Big 12, you have to really be doing, I think, a lot of self-reflection. You got to be looking internally here. I mean, yes, I'm sure they are actively looking for replacement institutions. Who can we get to replace Texas and Baylor? The fact of the matter is there's no one on the market. Notre Dame's not going to the Big 12. It's not going to happen. They're already basically tied into the ACC. That's all but official because of football's contract with NBC. I mean, all other varsity sports for Notre Dame are competing in the ACC. And there's really nobody else left on the market that's nearly as attractive as Texas or Oklahoma. Texas from a brand standpoint, and Oklahoma from, a moderate level of success in terms of conference championships and postseason appearances. Now, I'm not going to get into the historical numbers for those programs for Texas and Oklahoma, just talking about recently here, because I think, yes, historical success does factor in, like it certainly does, right? Because it influences our perception of the institution. We expect Notre Dame or Miami or any number of schools to be competitive, or they get ranked really, really high in the AP poll because, it's Miami, right? They win 3 games, they're top 10. Or it's Notre Dame, they win 4 games, they got to put them in the top 5. I mean, you see this sort of stuff with USC, the Trojans out in California. You see it with Florida State up till recently. A lot of schools benefit tremendously from just brand power alone, and the AP poll perpetuates that problem. I think it's a problem, but it perpetuates it because the AP poll is entirely built on brand recognition. Very little of it's merit-based, at least especially in the first few weeks of the season, where you're just lobbing darts at the board and you go, I don't really know. I know about this team. Let's stick them there. But again, getting back to this discussion about the Big 12, it's really going to be, I think, tough for them to survive. Certainly there is a path, there is a way that the Big 12 gets out of this. It's not going to be easy. And I think they're going to have to accept a reduced, national presence for a while. Honestly, I mean, it's gonna really hurt their overall perception across the country as a conference. Now, one of the silver linings, if there's any silver lining, but one of the silver linings out of all of this is that the Big 12. They not only have an opportunity to kind of rebrand themselves, because again, as we touched on at the top of this show, when you think Big 12, you think Texas and you think Oklahoma. That's immediately. If you're talking football, those are the programs that define the Big 12, that have defined the Big 12 since as long as I've been alive. You've had some schools in there that have had a few good years. TCU under Gary Patterson. You had RG3 at Baylor. You had Colin Klein at Kansas State when Snyder was still coaching there. I mean, you've had schools that have shown the ability to perform and execute on the national stage. But, this is really going to be, I think, a challenge for the Big 12 because you're losing your two flagship schools. And, the conference members really ultimately, they're going to have to decide, okay, do we want to stay together? Do the remaining 8 schools in the Big 10, do we want to stick it out? Or do we want to, just disband and kind of go out on our own? See, hey, what kind of deal can we strike? And you better believe that those kinds of discussions are going on in every boardroom at every Big 12 institution. And they're probably going on at almost every institution that's in a Power 5 conference. The other thing that really, the other wrinkle is in all of this is that we could see some Group of 5 teams making some moves. And there have been Group of 5 teams the last few years that have proved they can compete with these Group of 5 schools, these mid-tier Group of Power 5 schools, excuse me. And so you might see some Group of 5 schools start moving around and trying to strike deals. I think, though, and a lot of people have talked about this and beat it to death, and it's not something that I really even wanted to mention, but it is part of all of this, and that is that this deal, right? This announcement that Texas and Oklahoma are joining the SEC. This is just further cementing that conference's position at the pinnacle of college football. There's no other conference that has the depth that the SEC has. Not just now, before this. If you'd have said to me, who's the deepest? I felt like last year the Big Ten had the opportunity to get closer to the SEC, right? They had, they had Ohio State that was supposed to compete for a title. You had Wisconsin, that's usually pretty stout. Minnesota was coming off a great year. Michigan was sort of hanging around, and it just never really came to fruition. I mean, you ended up having an Indiana team that made some noise for the Big Ten, but other than Ohio State and Indiana, that was it. Michigan couldn't win a game. Wisconsin struggled mightily, and Minnesota was awful. So the Big Ten took a step back this past year. The ACC is still the Clemson Conference. ACC, another Clemson championship, every December in Charlotte. That's what it's become. And there's been no program really that has challenged Clemson to the point where people are starting to, say, oh, well, Clemson's not the lock pick for the ACC this year. I mean, there's, certainly some beat writers out there who I'm sure are penciling in Duke for an ACC title, but that's not realistic. It's going to be Clemson. Who else would you pick? Who in the ACC can compete with Clemson all season long? There's no one out there right now. There's a few schools that have shown, whether it's UNC or Syracuse a few years back, but it's not been consistent enough. So it's not a Big Ten. It's not the ACC. It certainly is not the Pac-12. They're not even hardly in the Power 5 anymore. I mean, we talked about that extensively during the COVID era, season, where it was like, how is the Pac-12 going to be able to get out of this hole they've created themselves? I mean, they canceled their season, and they had to backtrack it, then they had so many restrictions. They've really done a number on their ability to recruit. Now, I know college football in the Northwest is not what it is in rural Alabama. I understand that. But at the same time, you still have some schools in the Pac-12 that have got some great talent. California's a hotbed of talent, man. 4s and 5 stars everywhere. USC's loaded every year. Stanford usually has a great recruiting class. Oregon pulled great recruiting classes. Herm Edwards down at Arizona State's pulling in pretty good recruiting classes. Utah, a few years back now, has been pretty solid. So there are schools in the Pac-12 that, they are proving every season that, hey, eventually we can get back to competing with the big dogs. But going back to this, who's the deepest? It's the SEC. It's the SEC. And that was before this deal was even announced. Now, earlier in this offseason, we've had discussions about the proposal to move to a 12-team college football playoff. And that would be as early as the 2023 season. But a lot of that is hinged on the current conference structure. This is really important to note because we've already had several conference commissioners, including the Pac-12 commissioner, George, forgive me if I butcher this last name, Kalivkov. I think that's how you'd say it. He has already come out and he spoke to somebody at CBS Sports and said that any CFP expansion is going to be readdressed because of this conference realignment. I mean, I think that has been something that's sort of been overlooked. Like people have been they've been foaming at the mouth that Texas and Oklahoma are joining the SEC, that they've not stopped to think about, okay, what are the ramifications of this decision? How does this affect not just the SEC and the Big 12, but what does it do for bowl games and playoff potential and the structure of that playoff, and are we going to get it expanded, and how is that going to work? The SEC now has 16 total members, and 11 of the top 17 revenue-generating universities in the NCAA. That's huge. That is huge. You cannot ask for a better position if you're the SEC. Just both academically and athletically, the SEC has really secured their long-term success with this deal. Even though they were in great standing before. I mean, they were in fantastic standing before. This right here, it just puts them so far above everybody else that it's almost worth asking yourself, at what point do we bring the antitrust lawyers in and try and break the SEC up, right? Like how far are we going to go down this super conference road? And that's what's coming to. That's what it's coming to, right? This I think is the preliminary rounds of a long overdue conference realignment. And when I say long overdue, I don't mean it in the way of this should have happened decades ago. I mean it in the way of this has been in the plan. This has been a plan for a while, and we're finally seeing it in action. Like I don't. Do you really think that this is the Texas and Oklahoma just woke up one day and they were like, you know what? We're going to leave the Big 12. We're going to join the SEC. Screw it. No. This has been a conversation and a plan that has been in place, I am certain, at least 5 years. Minimum. It's got to be a minimum. It's sort of a thing where I'm not sure how other conferences will be able to, I don't even know. I mean, just deal with this sort of decision by Texas and Oklahoma to join. I mean, again, you look at the current landscape, right? You've got your Power 5 conferences in the ACC, the Big 10, the Big 12, the Pac-12, and the SEC. You got a 4-team college football playoff that everybody complains about. Every single person complains about the 4-team college football playoff. I thought from the beginning it should have been 6. I personally believed it should have been a 6-team playoff styled after the NFL, where the top 2 teams get byes. 3 plays 6, 4 plays 5. Then those winners play seeds 1 and 2, and you bracket it as a NFL conference playoff structure, right? Because you wouldn't have that other 6 teams. You would just have 6. But now the talk is let's make it 12. What is that? That's the NFL play. Now I think the NFL playoff structure has changed to include more teams, if I'm not mistaken. Honestly, I really don't pay much attention to the NFL anymore. It could have changed and I don't even know about it. But I believe that is the case. And in fact, I'm going to do a quick search here just to confirm, because I think as of like last year, I think that rule has changed. Yeah, okay, so I was correct here. So the 2020 NFL playoffs featured 14 teams overall. It's a new expansion that they started in 2020. So each conference gets 3 wild card instead of the previous 2. I thought that was right, but again, I pay so little attention to the NFL that I had to double check to make sure that I was correct in that. So again, the 12 for the CFP would be smaller than, I guess, now the current NFL structure, but still I think one that they probably would emulate with, I would imagine, the 1 and 2 seeds getting buys. I guess you would expand that down to maybe through the 4 seeds, so 1 through 4 get buys, and you sort of play games based off that. I kind of have to map it out on paper to see how that would work, and I don't know if any of that has even been finalized because, again, as we've mentioned, coming from the mouth of the Pac-12 commissioner, listen, now that this deal is out in the open with Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC, everything's up in the air. Playoff expansion structure, conference buy-ins, that sort of stuff. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And again, you're right. You look at the SEC and you go, okay, let's say at most you're probably going to be able to get, because make no mistake, while the depth of the SEC will become unmatched across college football, as it already was, but further unmatched, they're going to cannibalize one another. There will be just so many teams that in another conference would dominate or would only get by with 1 or 2 losses that are going to suffer 3, 4, maybe even 5 losses in an SEC with these kinds of schools. Now, how Texas and Oklahoma perform, that'll be something that I can speculate on, but you're not going to know until you actually see them play. Like, no one really knew that Mizzou was going to go to the SEC championship in their first year in the conference, but they did. A&M has been less impressive, but they've performed well last year, with that sole loss to Alabama that kept them out of the conference championship game. And Mizzou recently has had a lot of struggles, but you don't know how Texas and Oklahoma are going to do. I don't think so far know what division they're going to be in. You just know that they're going to be joining the SEC. And so, in terms of what does this mean for the future of college football and how, is it going to affect college football moving forward? I think it's taken us to a pretty I don't know. It's just a place where it's the rich are going to keep getting richer, and the poor are just going to keep getting poor. Right? There's just such a gap between the elite schools and the non-elite schools. Like I have this conversation with almost, I have this conversation with a person almost every week. In terms of who are the elite programs in the country, and there's really just 3 right now. There's 3. There's Alabama, there's Ohio State, and there's Clemson. Those are it in terms of elite programs. Programs that have enormous amounts of talent. Lots of schools have enormous amounts of talent, but those 3 programs develop the talent, retain the talent, and recruit new talent, and the process repeats. LSU, they can't do that. Georgia, they've gotten close, still can't do that. Notre Dame, can't do that. Oklahoma, sure, they've done it in the Big 12, but Lord, they get to the college football playoff, and it doesn't look like it, does it? So, in terms of elite programs, you got 3. And interestingly, only one of those is in the SEC. And that school, Alabama, has got a coach in Nick Saban who's 69 years old. It's very nice. And you got to wonder how much longer Saban's going to want to coach. How much longer is this guy going to do? He's got his 7 championships, and I would imagine pretty soon here he's going to want to say, all right, this was fun. I'm the greatest of all time. There's no doubt about that. But how much longer does he want to continue to coach? The man has 7 national championships. It's hard to even fathom. But again, only one elite team right now in college football that's in the SEC. And, I think programs rise and fall all the time, right? We see this every single year, where schools kind of come out of nowhere. They have a great season, like Indiana last year. I know that wasn't on my radar. I had no idea that Indiana was going to come out there and be the second best team in the Big Ten. Penn State. That was the other school I was forgetting earlier. There was a 5th team that I could not remember, and it was Penn State. The Nittany Lions is actually who I was predicting would challenge Ohio State more than anybody out of the Big Ten this past year, and they didn't. Right? Penn State did not. They're the team that couldn't win a game. I think I said it was Michigan earlier. I don't know, but it was a mistake on my part. But either way, it's just, you look at how things finished off last year. Alabama taking the national title, Clemson getting beat down pretty badly by Ohio State in that semifinal game, A&M finishing with a single loss, Florida somehow cracking the top 10 with 3 losses, Cincinnati going undefeated, Coastal Carolina putting up a very impressive 11-0 record, Georgia with 2 losses, Indiana with a single loss. Like there were so many teams in there that you weren't expecting. Now, you had your big name schools, your USC's 5-1, Miami was 8-2, Texas was 6-3, but all those schools I just listed were outside the top 15. They were never even in the hunt. If we go to a 12-team playoff, that pretty much leaves the door open for the top 20. All of a sudden, it becomes not who's in the top 8 or 10. It becomes who's in the top 20. Because if you got 12 playoff spots, my goodness. I mean, you can be in 16th and still have a chance to get in. But still, though, in terms of the future of college football, what does this mean for the sport? I think we're going to start to see conferences like the ACC, the SEC, and the Big Ten. I'm not sure yet about the Pac-12. I'm not sure. But those 3 that I mentioned previously, ACC, SEC, Big Ten, I think they're going to start to try and grow their rosters further. I think it would not surprise me to see 20 schools in a conference. SEC's nearly there. They're nearly there with the number that they have now. With, I guess, what would that be? It'd be 16 schools now? Yeah, 16 schools. So, I just don't think that's great for college football to have that many schools in one conference, and let alone the logistical challenge of travel for all the sports that aren't football, right? Because this is not just the Texas football team joining the SEC. This is Texas volleyball and Texas gymnastics and, Texas track and field and all of those sports now have to get on a plane and fly to Gainesville when there's a meet. That's a thing. And so it affects not just those football players, it affects all the student athletes. It affects the entire athletic department. What conference your school is in has a huge impact on the student-athlete experience. I'm just not sure that it's a great thing for college football. I don't think there's any avoiding it. I don't think there's anything we can really do about it. I think the wheel has been put into motion, and it's something that we're going to continue to see. Now, what schools kind of offer themselves up out of the group of 5? The American has supposedly been in talks to acquire some more Big 12 members. It could very well be that the American comes out of this a big winner and, siphons off 3 or 4 Big 12 members. Maybe they pick up TCU, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, and Texas Tech. And then all of a sudden the American is sitting there with, what would that be? They have 11 right now, right? So you get Cincinnati, East Carolina. Yeah. I think there's 11 schools. No, that can't be right. Is it 11? Yeah, no, it is 11. It's 11 schools in the American right now. So if you added 4 or 5, you could get 15, 16 members, and you could really be a pretty formidable conference. The ACC right now certainly wishes that they had more schools in the national spotlight, especially for football, because right now it's just Clemson. I don't know if they're as actively looking as, say, the SEC, but I'm sure it's on their radar now. And I'm sure they're. And actually, I saw something. This was hilarious. I saw something on Twitter yesterday. There was a media personality with the 4-letter sports network that I shall not name, and he was talking about how, according to sources, Clemson and Florida State were in talks to join the SEC, which was shot down almost immediately. Now, I'm sure at some point the phone has rang in Radakovich's office, or maybe, down there in Birmingham with the SEC commissioner's office, and maybe there's been some discussions, but I cannot believe that this is anything serious. Clemson stands to benefit in almost no way to join the SEC. I mean, they're the premier team in their current conference. They're a founding member of their current conference. And geographically, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, it just doesn't. I don't know why Clemson would join a conference that now has schools in Texas and Oklahoma. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. The ACC's got schools in Boston and Miami. But again, it's really just that eastern seaboard. I think the vertical travel is not as taxing. And this is coming from discussions I've had with student athletes, just out of curiosity. I say, hey, what's it like traveling, and how does that work for you? And what do you find to be the most challenging thing? And from what I've gotten out of the discussions with student athletes, vertical, meaning, you're traveling up or down the coast, that's not as taxing as horizontal travel, where you're actually changing time zones. Everything's a little different. It's a little off. That does have a real effect on people and their performance and those sorts of things. So I'm not sure if Clemson and Florida State are really in serious discussions to join the SEC. I think the ACC is pretty well set where it's at with its 14 members. But I mean, now again, you've got the SEC with 16 members, and you got to believe that you could see maybe the Big 12 and the Pac-12 kind of merge, right? Or maybe a few schools from the Big 12 jump ship. Maybe the westernmost schools out of the Big 12 jump ship, and the remaining schools go to the American. I think that's certainly a real possibility. You might see some schools go independent. You've got, as it stands right now, you have 7 independents. You have Army, BYU, Liberty, New Mexico State, Notre Dame, UConn, and UMass, which the only schools in that group that you really ever hear about are Notre Dame, BYU, and to some extent Liberty. So I just don't know if that'll be the route that a lot of those schools take. It will be interesting though. If the Big 12 sticks it out and they're all on board together with just 8 schools, they're going to fall behind fast, because there's not, as we've touched on, there's not really a marquee team besides Oklahoma State. Maybe Iowa State will step up. Maybe West Virginia will become more consistent. But as it stands right now, there's not a single team that you can really point to and say, yeah, they're a national contender. And that's the same problem the Pac-12 is having, right? There's no one in the Pac-12 that you can go, oh, yeah, I mean, they could definitely be in contention at the end of the year. I mean, it's just, no, there's no one there. I mean, look at the final poll from last year. The first Pac-12 team, it's USC at 17th. There isn't another Pac-12 team until you get to Oregon at 25th. I think they just stuck them in there so that the Pac-12 could say they had multiple teams in the top 10. That's it. Oregon and USC. USC was 5-1. Oregon was 4-2. Now, that was more a product of the COVID scheduling disaster for the Pac-12, but it still illustrates how handicapped they are. And the Big 12 schools, your Texas Techs that are in Texas, they may look at that and say, ugh, I don't want to be a part of a conference that's got the Northwest, Washington State, Oregon, California laws and restrictions. I don't want to be part of that. I have no desire to be a part of that. That's probably something that's being discussed right now in those Big 12 school offices. I don't, what conference best fits our, athletic expectations, our student climate, our alumni. I mean, that's a huge thing, because when you join a conference, the majority of your games are going to be against conference opponents, right? You're not going to play 8 non-conference games. You're going to play 8 conference games, sometimes 9, and have a handful that are non-conference. So it's really going to be, I think, interesting to see what these schools do. So far as I have seen, there have been no official announcements from any Big 12 schools, but I have seen, some whisperings about the Big 12 and the Pac-12 discussing a merger. Because make no mistake, the television deal for the Big 12 just took a huge hit. I mean, a huge hit. But you could, add some games from Pac-12 powers like USC, Oregon, Washington, and that would help soften that blow. And it would really help the Pac-12 also get attention, desperately needed attention for, getting back into that college football playoff race, because that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. And if you're only able to get teams in the CFP because it's a 12-team deal as opposed to a 4-team deal, it's going to be hard for the other power conferences to take you seriously, right? The SEC is not going to take you seriously because you're just going to show up and get beat down. The ACC, when I say the ACC, I mean Clemson. Clemson's not going to take you seriously if they can show up and take you out behind the woodshed and beat you down. So, again, a lot to consider here for both conferences in the Pac-12 and the Big 12. But, it's going to come down to TV deals and money, because that's what it's always going to come down to. Now, both the Big 12 and the Pac-12 have TV rights deals with ESPN and Fox. So, how that all works out from a legal standpoint, again, I imagine lawyers are going to have to get involved, because, if you're talking about a complete merger, that's a 20-team super conference, assuming that no programs were pushed out, and that would give the new Pac-12, Big 12, whatever you want to call that, I'll call it the West Conference, that would be 4 more teams than the SEC. So then I think if this were to happen, if this hypothetical played out, I think the SEC would begin to actively recruit for new members. I think the ACC would really have to reconsider and go, well, we only got 14 members. The West Conference, we'll call them, has 20. The SEC has 16. The Big Ten might be adding some more. We need to bulk up our roster. So I think you could really see an arms race in terms of gathering and bringing on new institutions. And I just don't know if that's going to be something that's going to benefit college football long term. But it's like I said, it's already, the wheels are in motion here. I don't think that there's any way of stopping it unless, they have come up with a way to break up the SEC with some sort of antitrust investigation. I don't know. They're too deep. They're too deep across the board. But it's going to be really interesting to see how it all plays out. But yeah, this, like I said, this episode was something that I've been wanting to do for a few weeks now, and now that I've kind of gotten into my schedule at my new position at Fox Sports, I'm excited to do these again. I'm definitely going to get consistent with them, and the goal is to do at least one a week, hopefully 2, one earlier in the week, maybe one Monday or Tuesday release, and then we'll do one later in the week, maybe a Thursday, Friday, or maybe even a Saturday recap of the college football games from that week. So yeah, excited to be doing these shows again. And like I said, you can find them on Anchor, or anywhere you subscribe to podcasts, listen to podcasts. All you got to do is search After Further Review. You can listen there anywhere, anytime on the go, or you can go to the AFR Facebook page. You just got to search After Further Review. Every single episode I've ever done is all there, uploaded for your listening or watching pleasure. And like I said, it's going to be a fun college football season, and I'm excited to be back in the saddle for it. So enjoy the rest of your week. College football is inching closer, and I'm excited. So long. We'll see you next time. I'm Jay Smith, and this has been After Further Review.